the Permanent International Committee of Linguists, the Asociación de Linguística y Filología de América Latina, la Sociedad Argentina de Estudios Lingüísticos, the Asociación Internacional de Linguística Aplicada, the Societas Lingüística Europea, the Linguistic Society of America, the Linguistics Association of Great Britain, the Australian Linguistic Society, and the British Association of Applied Linguistics for selecting us to present in this wonderful series. Welcome to all of you. I wish I could see your beautiful faces. Language comes in at least two modalities, the oral one of spoken languages and the manual visual one of sign languages. Linguistics has embraced this position for around 60 years now. However, the analysis of sign languages has not had a great effect on linguistic theories or practice. Reading books about linguistics, we can get the impression that pretty much everything we know about spoken languages holds of sign languages, where the only difference is the articulators and the perceptual receptors. This is a false impression. Something as basic as the circumstances in which children learn language can differ drastically between most deaf children and most hearing children. Most deaf children have to struggle to acquire language because their families are hearing, whereas most hearing children acquire it without heroic effort. Examination of these circumstances and their linguistic consequences can shed new light on first language acquisition and on variation in adult language. Likewise, daily communication experiences can differ drastically between most deaf people and most hearing people. The experiences of being a deaf person in a hearing world can color sign language literature with respect to its very purpose, its topics, and the ways in which it mines modality for aesthetic and communicative effect. Finally, matters of first language acquisition, of communication experiences, and especially of modality, can impact all components of the grammar, challenging the very architecture of these components. The idea that phonetics is discrete from semantics or has only a limited interface with it, for example, simply cannot be maintained in light of sign language grammars. In the presentations offered here tonight, our researchers take up matters of language acquisition, literature, and grammatical analysis. Their work highlights how consideration of the overall linguistic situation of deaf children and adults is crucial in their areas of research. Their work is exemplary of the more enlightened approach of linguists in this century. Our first presenter is Ronice Muller de Quadros. She is full professor at the Federal University of Santa Catarina since 2002. She is a researcher at CNPq, the Brazilian National Science Foundation. She holds a master's degree from 1995 and a PhD from 1999 in linguistics. Her research areas include the grammar of Libras, bimodal bilingualism, sign language policies, and the acquisition of Libras. My hope is that she is already familiar to all viewers. Professor Quadros is one of the most respected sign language linguists in the world. For her analytic work, surely but also for her leadership and how linguists can advocate for language rights successfully. Her reasoned arguments and tireless efforts have been foundational to the present bilingual, bicultural model of deaf education in Brazil. And here she is.
Thank you, Donna Jo, for the wonderful introduction. I'm happy to be on this panel with the other researchers, and DJ has organized it, so thank you very much for that. Today, my talk is more related to the epistemological approach. I will be focusing on researchers who work within deaf education, as well as sign language research and analysis. My talk will be covering deaf rights, language policies, ethical issues, empowerment of deaf people, as well as empowerment of sign languages. All of these topics are interrelated and important for deaf people and researchers. So to start, we will be discussing deaf rights. I'm sure you are aware of WFD, the World Federation for the Deaf, and Sign Language Acquisition. And you may know that deaf children are supported as needing to acquire sign language prior to education. So they need to have that exposure to sign language as a part of their development and growth. And what research is showing is that supports that idea. Sign language education is a right for all deaf people. And we can see this as an example in Brazil. How they have established deaf schools and supported this exposure of sign language for deaf education. It's also important that for deaf education, they are not isolated. They need to be in groups and learning. The idea of mainstream education is not successful because sign language must be acquired in groups or as a collective. Sign language access is also important. It's a deaf right, wherever they are. Bilingual education, as you know, many deaf individuals are bilingual themselves. They have their own sign language that they use, and then they can also read or write in the spoken language of their country. So they are bilingual, and providing this bilingual education is important for them as well. All of these that I've mentioned are rights, and they are important for the deaf community. And as researchers, we must remember all of these rights. Also, we need to remember that language is important, language planning is important within language policies. Language policies impact deaf people each person needs to explain what is important for them as an individual. Each deaf person needs to explain what they want from their language as part of the language planning process. Without language planning, if a deaf person joins the conversation or a discussion, they are not included. The deaf people need to be leading that discussion. It's also their right. In Brazil, we have experience with legal planning for language recognition. For several years now, we can see different examples of deaf experiences with the Federation. This is the sign for Federation. And deaf people as a collective are always supporting this planning process and how associations establish various laws in relation to language and signing accessibility across the nation. The Federation will never work on its own. They always work in conjunction with researchers and deaf people and anthropologists as a collective. And this collective works together to give power back to deaf people and give them the opportunity to lead this planning process and make more successful laws. And the first successful law passed in 2002. And it's specifically focused on the sign language within Brazil. Brazil agreed that across the nation, deaf people have their right to their own sign language. But there will be a national language, national sign language. And then in 2005, the Federation, together with anthropologists and researchers and deaf people, came up with a government plan. And within this plan, it was very important that there was an establishment of a sign language policy across the nation. And this sign language policy or program was put in place for teachers to teach sign language as well as how to interpret or to teach using sign language. And then in 2014, there was a national plan for education that was put in place across the nation. And this includes one specific focus for deaf education, bilingual education. And this starts from babies, so 0 to 18 years of age. They have to be exposed to sign language within the education system from birth to 18 years old. And since the passing of that law, that has changed how education is established across the nation. We are aware that in Europe, there are a few countries that also have laws for deaf people. Some have bilingual education and sign language recognition. But some of these countries are struggling because they are not including deaf people in how they plan and how they establish these policies. It's important to work together with deaf people and have them involved for equality reasons, and because they can then help establish more successful laws within the government system. Language planning impacts sign language research as well as deaf education. Ethical issues is the third focus for my talk today. I have a few questions, and they're all ethical questions that we as researchers must keep in mind. How does my research within the sign language community affect deaf communities? Why am I researching? What is my purpose for researching and my purpose for the deaf community? If I am a hearing person, how can I plan my research with collaboration with deaf people within their own research, so other deaf colleagues, and ensure that there is empowerment? How can I establish this rapport and relationship with other deaf colleagues? And how can I empower deaf individuals and support their own research and their own work? I can empower those who are working with me, but also empower my colleagues to work with each other and work on their own academic environment. And lastly, how can I use sign language as empowerment? How can I empower sign language and make it so it's not inequality? There is no inequalities happening. All of these questions are ethical issues. And it is important for us as researchers to keep them in mind and to consider them within our work. If we apply the ethical model to the deaf community, one way to do it is think about within the sign language community, working as a collective. Respecting linguistic and cultural, social characteristics, their beliefs and habits. That's our responsibility, to consider all of these different factors within the deaf community and when we're thinking about what we want to do as researchers, we have to think about how they're feeling. And when we are making our way, including them in that process. We also have to think about how our research will be benefiting them. What does my research give to the deaf community? That must be clear for them as well as ourselves. We also need to understand the diversity within the deaf community. Many researchers focus on just a few deaf people and they'll heavily research. And then they will tell large generic statements about the entire deaf community that are not true because they've only focused on a small sample group and not considered the rest of the deaf community. We have to be careful when we do that. Also, when researching the deaf community and their sign language, we must be using sign language. I am a linguist, and I can research any language. But sometimes when we think that, we forget that we're hearing. And if we're working within sign language, then we have to learn the sign language and we have to learn to communicate with the people that we are working with. Understanding the people that we're researching and understanding the language is important. Some will think, oh, I'm a linguist and I don't know sign, but I can research sign language linguistics still. But then you don't know sign language. And deaf people want to see us. They want to see us signing, and they want to see our explanations and our arguments and our research about sign language. They don't just want to speak to us or see us speaking. We must keep that in mind. It's a very important point. Deaf empowerment is the next topic. As a researcher, I have to support the deaf community and deaf people and empower them. In Brazil, we have several examples of how we've done that through our development. There's many deaf researchers across the nation. It's really grown. And that process happened because of the empowerment and the support of the deaf community. The deaf community here has to have access and access to education. When we see deaf people with higher educations, with PhDs and master's degrees, and higher levels of education, you can see how those individuals take hold of that empowerment that we've given to them. In Brazil, all of the deaf people that have PhD educations are about 50. So there's about 50 of them altogether. And all of them have a job. Some of them have the same job that I have as a full-time professor. They're all my colleagues. And it's nice because they're all full-time professors and they have the same benefits that I have. I can see across the board that we have this equality, and we can discuss with these various colleagues. We can have more discussions on language planning and language research and more involvement. And that's primarily because we've seen that they have been empowered, or they have empowerment. Higher levels of education is only the start, but very beneficial. We can also see examples of deaf leadership within Brazil. Not only do we have upper level education teachers, but we also have members in government, and they are a part of this process of planning for deaf education and working together with other researchers and developing and encouraging deaf rights. My last topic is empowerment of sign language. The area of sign language research has a lot of documentation across Brazil. Up until this point, we've noticed the importance of research for sign language. And this has been noticed all across Brazil. And the corpus of sign language and access to documentation and seeing all of these sign language is very important and has really encouraged the research here. Additionally, through research in various different regions, not just a single one, but different aspects rather, is important. Deaf people are now taking on the research themselves in their own sign language, which is very important. We saw before that it was always hearing linguists researching sign language, but now the deaf research community has really grown and they are starting to research and analyze their own language. And they do their own research as well as collaborate with other hearing colleagues. It's important with this collaboration process that the researchers feel this level of equality, that not one is more superior than another. We can see in Brazil how our sign language has really developed and supported this empowerment of deaf people. And spreading out the power is very important. Instead of keeping it in one place with a few different people, spreading it all across the nation of Brazil. Have good researchers in the north and the south and the west and the east. That is very important as well, to really capture the whole nation. Another important experience that we can take from Brazil is how our deaf education has really empowered deaf people and really focusing on teaching the deaf, but as first focusing on teaching the deaf, but as well as training sign language interpreters. We see often that other countries will focus just on interpreter education. But then what about the deaf people? They also need to develop their education. And if they develop their education, while you're also training more interpreters, then it means more deaf in higher education and more success across the community. In conclusion, all of the various topics that I have touched on today, we as researchers, we need to consider all of these and keep them in mind. We see deaf empowerment spreading across the nation of Brazil. And we can also see strong connections with each other, networks that are so strong. And all of these factors give a higher level of deaf awareness. If we give more deaf awareness to our situations, then more deaf people will be able to show themselves and thrive. Thank you. And thank you to the interpreter as well.
Okay, thank you, Ronice, and thank you very much to our interpreters. Our next presenter is Rachel Sutton-Spence. Professor Sutton-Spence has been researching sign language linguistics since 1989, and she lost her heart to sign language literature in the late 1990s. She worked in the United Kingdom at the Center for Deaf Studies at Bristol University from 1989 to 2013, before moving to Federal University of Santa Catarina. Working from an understanding that creative language is where we can see many linguistic processes most clearly, she has been exploring the ways in which language makes the phenomenon that we call sign language literature. Frustrated by lack of materials for research and teaching, especially teaching to encourage deaf young people to create their own literature, and inspired by the creativity of the deaf communities in Britain and Brazil, she has worked on sign language literature anthologies for over a decade. She's the author of 2 9/10, almost 3 books on sign language literature. Analyzing Sign Language Poetry, which came out in 2005, Introducing Sign Language Literature, which came out in 2016, and she collaborated on that with Michiko Kaneko, and Literatura and Libras, to be published as a bilingual text in Portuguese and Libras soon. So let's welcome Rachel.
Good evening to everybody. Thank you very much for the invitation to take part in this wonderful opportunity to talk to so many people about the thing that we all love, the sign language linguistics. One never starts a presentation with an apology, but I will start with an explanation. First of all, that our town suffered a huge storm yesterday. We lost power, we lost internet, and I'm very grateful to a friend. I rode my bicycle across town until I found somebody who had both power and an internet, and he let me in and he's let me use his computer. So I'm not very familiar with his computer. I hope this is going to work. Please be patient. The second thing I need to tell you follows on to something that Ronice said, and I agree completely with what she said, that it's the responsibility of those of us who are hearing to, wherever possible, present our findings on sign language studies in sign language directly to the deaf community. My primary sign languages are British Sign Language and Libras, and it just wasn't going to work this evening having me using either of those sign languages, which is why I'm going to speak English, and I am very grateful to all the interpretation that's going on behind the scenes to make this happen. Next week, I will be giving 2 lives to 2 different groups in Brazil, and I will be using Libras then. So what I would like to talk about this evening is what can we learn as people who are interested in language as linguists from sign language literature. To my mind, the study of language and literature must go together. If we want to understand the structure and the use of language within its cultural context, we do need to look at its creative forms. These creative forms have their roots in everyday language. And conversely, everyday language often has its roots in its literature. And we can't just look at one or the other. I think we really do need to look at both sides, language and literature, to really understand what's going on in the language of so many deaf communities that we've been talking about from the study of linguistics. Sign language linguists have known this from the start. Klima and Belugi's wonderful study, The Signs of Language, which came out in 1979, and anybody who hasn't read it, get hold of it. It's the most wonderful explanation. It just started, it set my heart alight when I read it in the early 80s. Their study, there's a wonderful chapter in there, chapter 14, note it down, chapter 14. They have got a wonderful study of sign language creativity, of sign language poetry as it was understood back in the 1970s in American Sign Language. That study there showed the richness of ASL literature back then, and things have moved on so much further since then. From then on, any sort of data collection, the corpuses that Ronice was talking about, for example, that have been collected in many sign languages around the world, they all involve asking people to tell stories. Now, these aren't necessarily literature per se, but these are deaf people telling stories. They're often one section of the data collection will ask people, will show people either a short film or some pictures and ask people to, signers, to retell these stories in their own signs. In Europe, for example, certainly in the 80s and 90s, it was almost de rigueur to collect data that used the snowman. It was a beautiful visual film with no words. And signers used those, signers were producing versions of the snowman for many years across Europe. Frog, Where Are You is another one. The Pear Story. These are all quite well-known materials, ask stimulus materials to get signers to produce materials. But why not look at sign language literature as it is produced by sign language artists? Why can we not be studying the material produced by people that the communities, that deaf communities consider to be artistic signers? Why can we not study what the community considers to be good creative language? And to be honest, usually the answer was because we couldn't. We didn't have the resources. We didn't have access to this. Klima and Belugi, when they did their study, they had access to 2, 3 poets. They had a very small data source. Now, with these collections of anthologies, we've got a much better chance of studying good, high quality, creative language, sign language in the hands of masters. And I use masters with open gender, men, women, anybody. So it's really worth looking at what is now an increasingly well-documented body of creative sign language. I'm just going to take a brief aside to explain a little bit. There are 2 terms that are around. There is sign language literature and there is deaf literature. And there's a lot of confusion. What do we mean by the 2? But really, I think they're 2 sides of the same coin, 2 sides of the same language and cultural coin when we look at the language used by the literature and language used by deaf people. So if we say that deaf literature is produced by deaf people on topics relating to the experience of deaf people and is aimed at a deaf audience in sign language, if we take these 4 criteria, now not all of them, not all sign language literature fulfills all 4 criteria. It may fulfill 3, sometimes 2, but many of them fulfill all 4 of those criteria. That they're produced, that this is literature produced by deaf people on topics relating to deaf people, aimed at deaf people, in the language of deaf people. I mean, honestly, what is not to like for a sign language linguist in this? It's the perfect resource. So by sign language literature, what I want to talk about is this body of creative and artistic sign language. It might be poetry, they could be stories, theatre, jokes that are composed and performed by deaf people. And yes, what is said is very important, and so is the way it is said. And in sign language literature, the language stands out from the everyday. It becomes foregrounded as something particularly special. The researcher, the ASL researcher Heidi Rose, she described it as a fusion of language, of visual imagery, and dance. And I love that as a definition. But I think we can often say that a lot of what we see in sign language is a fusion of language, visual imagery, and dance. And it actually challenges us to think about what those 3 things might look like together and separately, taking that as a definition. I'm going to try and show you a couple of examples, just very brief ones. If this doesn't work, we'll just come back to me talking and seeing the interpreter. Before I start, I just want to say it's performed. The first one I want to show, if this works, is performed by my deaf colleague Fernanda Machado. Machado is Machado interpreters. It's called Where Food Comes From, and it's a social commentary about the conditions of poor rural workers in Brazil and rich city dwellers who really don't think about where their food comes from. And it's very brief, which is why I thought it's something we could watch. For those of you who aren't familiar with sign language literature, I'd like to suggest that you look at the way she divides space, left and right-hand side, so that one side is always going to be talking about the poor rural laborer, and the other side is always going to be talking about the rich city dweller who really doesn't think about where their food comes from. If this sharing of the screen doesn't work, I'll come up with some other plan, but here goes. Looks like I'm not going to be able to do it. I don't know whether anybody technical can help me or whether we should just move on. I don't seem to have a share screen.
Rachel,
yeah.
You have
I do see it. I had to expand my screen.
Yes.
Yeah. Right. Thank you, Ronice. Okay, let's give this a go.
You have to unshare. You click again in the green spot.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah. Thank you. Okay, so I hope that you saw from that an example of sign language literature of highly visual, highly communicative. I hope some of you found quite emotionally powerful literature that used sign language in a very succinct and brief and powerful way. I don't think I'm going to have time for the next one, but I hope that that was just an example that you could, those of you who've not seen it before, you can take home. Now, sign language literature I think of as being important because from a personal view of deaf people, from a community view of deaf people, sign language literature both develops and stems from deaf identities, from individual identities, so that a deaf person can say, I am me. I am all the me's that I could be, including a deaf person. And this can be expressed through sign language literature. And by taking part in sign language literature, the deaf person can develop that sense of the deaf me. It can develop social identities. I am, or I want to be, a member of a particular social group, or I am, or I don't want to be, a member of a particular social group. And that again is expressed through the sign language literature. And thirdly, it expresses linguistic identity. It helps deaf people to develop. It supports deaf people's identities from a linguistic sense. I use and I relate to signed languages, to spoken languages, to written languages in different ways, and this can be expressed through sign language literature. And it's important for deaf people of all ages to express themselves and to see others expressing these types of identities. It's absolutely crucial for the development of deaf children. What Ronice was saying about deaf education and deaf teachers in education, just as a small example, I was talking to a deaf woman who is a teacher who was working with a deaf boy who refused to accept that he was deaf. He had a cochlear implant and he didn't accept that he was deaf. He didn't accept that he should learn sign language. He is deaf and he does need to learn sign language, but he wouldn't accept that. We worked with her to show him some of the stories that we've been developing for deaf children within the sign language anthology. And he sat up and he took notice when he saw a sign language story about a smelly, destructive monkey, and another one when he saw a story about an ant that realized that she was in the nude and she needed to get dressed. Now, these were silly stories. They were designed particularly to appeal to deaf children. And it was really nice when she gave us feedback afterwards and she said, at last, he took notice of sign language. He watched the video, he laughed, he wanted to be involved, he repeated the signs, he started playing. So this really does have an impact. This literature is so important for deaf children, for deaf adults. We need it for teachers, and we need good materials for teachers to be able to show for the deaf teachers of hearing adults who want to learn sign language, the deaf teachers who are working with deaf children who need to develop their sign language. We need to have this material in anthologies. We wouldn't expect teachers of any other language to turn up in front of their class to teach literature or language without some sort of backup of a collection of socially approved canonical literature. We shouldn't expect deaf teachers to have to do this either. So it's very important that we develop these anthologies. And I've been working with Fernanda Machado. That's particularly why I wanted to show you that video. I've been working with her and Ronice on this anthology of Libras literature. We've now got 60 examples of sign language poems, and part of the study has been to find out what we mean by a sign language poem, and of stories, both of deaf origin, which I'd like to talk a bit more about, and those that are stories but not of deaf origin. So they're either adaptations or retellings or translations of stories from Hearing Society that are to be a resource for teachers, as I said, either first language or second language use of sign language, parents, very important, parents who want to learn sign language with their children, sign language artists who want to learn new skills, think about new ways of expressing themselves, and researchers, as Ronice, as Donna Jo said, there's a shortage of good material for us to research, and for community members. And we collected material from all over the place. YouTube, social network sites, courses that we have taught and organized, festivals we've run. We invited known artists in Brazil to produce films for us, to tell stories for us. We invited deaf community members to tell their own stories. And we tried to get a regional balance, as Ronice said, so important to express the whole of Brazil, gender balance, ethnic heritage, age, and over half of the people we filmed were also teachers. Half the people had some sort of training in sign language literature. Not everybody, but it was we've got a good wide collection. All of those videos we've done detailed head notes for, explaining the context of the piece, some of the linguistic features to look for, what the interesting things are in each piece. But I was taken up short when somebody asked me, what have you got for very young deaf people? And the answer was nothing. We couldn't find anything already existing that was deaf literature made by deaf people with the intention of showing it to deaf children on a deaf topic in sign language. We couldn't find anything in Brazil. So we came up with it. We got together a project and we came up with handshake games. We based it on an American book that some of you may know by Smith and Jacobowitz called Have You Ever Seen?, which is a wonderful book on ASL that plays with handshake games. It's ludicrous. And this is what we wanted. We wanted to develop ludicrous situations. So, for example, for us in Libras, we asked, have you ever seen a cow in high heels? Now, in Libras, you've got a cow, so that's the sign. And then you've got the high heels, where the cow is walking in high heels. So it's a handshake game. So all the stories always use one handshake. So we made them ludicrous. We made them exaggerated. All the characters are deaf. They do deaf things. We used constructed action. We used illustrations. And we provided an orientation video for teachers to use. I don't know whether the organizers would be able to post the link. I kind of hope that they would, but if not, never mind. If people are interested, they could get in touch with me and I can send you the link. So with all this material, just briefly, I want to say why I think this is so important for linguists. Sign language literature, any literature, is a place to play with language. Sign language literature is a place for us to play with sign language. We don't need to worry about these traditional Saussurean structured units, containers. We don't have boundaried things like morphemes and phonemes. We don't even really know what a sign is. Creative signing is going to blur those boundaries. It's got signs that don't obey phonological rules. Signers make up morphemes if they want them, if they need them. It's very difficult to say that's a sign, that's the next sign. They blend into each other. They mix images with signs. More and more sign language literature now is working on video, blending images with signs. They're supporting the signs with other film, with pictures behind. Some signs are even, sometimes the images are placed on the signer's body. We're breaking down these differences between what is sign language and what isn't in an attempt to create an emotional, meaningful linguistic form. Those of you who don't know much about sign language, there is a set of constructions in sign language, which in linguistics we call the sign language classifiers. Sign languages have a limited number of handshapes that they use to represent categories of different reference that have a shared properties. And they're usually related to the shape. So in a lot of sign languages, this single finger relates to an upright person who's moving. But different languages have different classifiers. So for example, in ASL, if you wanted to show a bicycle moving, you would use this hand shape. If you were in BSL, in British Sign Language, if you wanted to use a bicycle moving, you'd use this hand shape. And in Libras, you'd use this hand shape. So each language has got its own classifier hand shape. Sorry, they're fixed, defined, no fudging. You can't make it up. You can't just make up your own classifier hand shape. And in sign language literature, you can. In sign language literature, you can be creative. You can say, for example, as Paul Scott, a British poet, said, this hand shape, this is a blind person using a cane. Right? That's not part of the sign language, but he made it up, and now people like to use it. Another one he used, this is a dog. And it's particularly a dog because it's going to pee against a lamppost. No, a tree. It's going to pee against a tree. Now, that's not a classifier for any dog in any sign language that we know, and certainly not in Paul Scott's sign language. It doesn't matter. He created it, and he particularly created it, and this is another thing that children love. Show this one to any deaf class, and they just love the idea of a dog peeing against a tree. So this kind of fun that you can have with signs, with sign language literature, to break those rules. So really, this whole idea of sign language, of us studying sign language literature, just to conclude here, is why do we need it? First of all, it shows us the beauty of sign language. If we're going to get behind sign language, and again, this was something that Ronice was saying, you have to love it. And honestly, anybody who gets involved in sign language literature, sign language in any way, it's very easy to lose your heart to sign languages. They are beautiful, rich languages, and a place to see this is in sign language literature. It forces us to look at sign languages in a new way, and it shows us the potential for sign languages. And because it shows us the potential, we can explore those limits. We can say, okay, that's as far as we go. Now we can see what sign languages could do. How far can we push it? And with that, I think it's really going to help us see the limits of all human language. Where can we go with human language? And with that, I think the crucial thing is it really teaches us to respect sign languages and the people who produce this amazing form of literature. And that's where I'll stop. Thank you very much.
Okay. Thank you, Rachel. Another wonderful presentation. Our final presenter is Erin Wilkinson. Erin's fascination with languages began when she was very young. She was born to a hearing family who did not know how to sign, and all together they learned American Sign Language. Books introduced her to English. She constantly asked her parents how and why English worked in specific ways. It was a sure sign that she was a bona fide linguist. Her love for learning languages and traveling led her to the formal study of linguistics. During her last year in high school, she went to Norway as an exchange student at a residential school for the deaf. There, she discovered that Norwegian Sign Language was a completely different language from ASL. It prompted her to pursue formal studies in order to better understand bilingualism in signing populations, sign language policy, language change and variation in sign languages, and sign language typology. Her current studies, in collaboration with other researchers, examine bilingualism in highly diverse communities with respect to language socialization and language planning and policy. She also collaboratively explores how linguistic structures are restructured over time in sign languages and the possible factors that contribute to language change and variation in diverse sign language communities in the lens of usage-based theory. So let's welcome Erin.
Hello, everyone. I'm thrilled to have been invited to present you with my view about sign languages. Same as we've heard from Ronice and Rachel, I'm going to be talking about deaf people in their context, right, within their communities and so forth. I'm going to speak a little bit more generally, not just about deaf folks, but also about sign language research and researchers and how linguists present and analyze and look at all of this information. One thing that I've been thinking about for a very long time, and I know that many of my colleagues have heard me bring this up in different discussions that I've had with them, and that is that I think we need to talk about so-called majority signed languages and what in the world is going on with those. I think it's important because in our research and our analysis and our study of sign language, and specifically within sign language typology, there's been discussion about some new information about this certain view, which is how sign languages emerge and what that looks like. So there's going to be a little bit of the discussion of, this idea and concept of development. One view could be that sign languages just grow and grow upon a one-directional path, a unidirectional path, and reach this ultimate point where they become equivalent of spoken languages. But there is another view that I'd like to talk about, which is called language ecology. And language ecology is a way of taking into account all of these different social and societal factors that can impact language structure, and how that comes to be and how it can change. Different characteristics of language that can change language structure, that can change and evolve. So I think that's been something that's been discussed within the field for a long time. I want to talk a little more specifically on majority sign languages, because I have this question, maybe more than one question. I've noticed something that I want to talk about here. Anytime you take a look at any research that's been done in sign languages, I think that we often see what's called school-based or institution-based sign languages, or they're sometimes referred to as deaf community sign languages. And I think when we hear those terminologies used for those, we know that that's referring to, okay, there is a specific designated location where deaf people congregated. And so within that location, the language emerged and grew and thrived. So that's what people are calling a majority sign language sometimes. It has different labels. Another example, or an example, would be American Sign Language as well as Libras. There are many across the globe where they have their own concept of maybe what a majority sign language means. But I want us to keep in mind that there's also another category of sign languages, and this is sometimes referred to as indigenous sign languages. And there's a variety of ways of referring to these. And within this type of indigenous sign language, you have sort of a high incidence of deafness. There's also a large number, of course, of hearing people, but they're all using sign language within this community, and they're usually in a very localized area. So I'd like to take advantage of the time today to talk about something that I've noticed. I think linguists view these two types of sign languages differently. Majority versus indigenous sign languages, and as if they sort of follow different paths from one another. And I'm not certain I agree with that. I think we need to really unpack this and take a look at it. I mean, we've got majority sign languages I wonder why they're even referred to that way. Let's think about this. Documentation has happened, you know, you've read lots of studies, and so you may realize that in the past, if we were looking worldwide and thinking about the establishment of residential schools for deaf people, I think most happened in the 18th and 19th century. So previous to that, deaf people were scattered and isolated and not found within deaf schools. Once deaf schools were established in different countries, deaf people who did not know one another tended to all end up in one location. Now, these people had different backgrounds, different experiences, a wide variety of people all found themselves in one location and needing to communicate with one another. Now, some people that were there may have had deaf people in their family or experience with other deaf people, and some hadn't. But what ended up happening there was what's called peer-to-peer transmission of the language. So that was happening 18th, 19th century in these schools for the deaf. So time goes on as time does. And eventually, I think we all realize what's happened is that deaf people, now keep in mind, deaf schools were boarding schools, so deaf people were there for extended periods of time. They stayed overnight, they had all their meals there, they were very much in that environment 24/7. So if we think about what that would have looked like and been like for them. So this was an ongoing situation for quite a long time. But then, of course, it didn't stay that way. Some of you, probably many of you, have heard that schools for the deaf, for example, where I am here in the United States, as well as my experience in Canada, Europe, and what I've heard from Australia, is that deaf students who would have been going to schools for the deaf are less and less so going to schools for the deaf. So because of that drop in enrollment, some schools for the deaf have even closed. So my question after knowing that information means, so what's happened from that point on, as there's been this diminishing enrollment and less of that localized interaction that deaf people had? What's that such a huge change in their ecology? So what has that done to the structure of the grammar, for example? What might we see in the language that would be a result of that change in the language ecology? I think that's a really big question that could use some looking into. I think we haven't really addressed that issue of language fragility. And that is a big one. That's something that we know is there and we've seen. Let me present you with one argument. This is from a researcher whose name is Trevor Johnson. Trevor is an Australian linguist, and he published a very widespread book back in the early 2000s that had to do with Aslan. And I think it's a little problematic because we need to think about, okay, language ecology, and thinking about Aslan, and thinking about deaf people, and this huge shift that has happened. And this is something that Trevor has talked about. Let me give you an idea of where I'm going with this. It used to be that deaf people, typically the Australian government would have them attend schools for the deaf. They had been established since the 1860s, so there were schools for the deaf in place. And so that was the situation for a while. And like I described earlier, that was what was going on. And then there was a change in the education policy that happened in the 1950s. And there was more of an encouragement for deaf students to be mainstreamed rather than attending schools for the deaf. So that went on for 20 years or so. And at that point, it was really the majority of deaf students were at schools for the deaf. So I'm sorry, we're mainstreamed in public schools. And so very few deaf students were attending schools for the deaf. So what happened, I wonder, in terms of Aslan? So that is what he talks about in that book. I think that we need to think about something here. If we think about this location, the central location where deaf people were congregating and were socializing and interacting and using language. It was that, yes, but it was also, there was happening some changes to the genetic pool, right? Because when you congregate like that and you socialize with people, you tend to marry those people that you're near to. You have children, perhaps. If it's genetic deafness, it would be passed on. So then you have deaf parents with deaf children. And so because of that, schools for the deaf could even bring in more deaf children. And so there was that genetic aspect of what was going on in the social setting. Now, with those schools for the deaf not seeing that anymore, so there's going to be a change then in the genetic pool. So that means that inherited deafness would maybe be less. Maybe there's a dilution there of the genes. And so there's that change that would happen. Also need to think about the social network that used to be so strong and robust, which changed because of the schools closing. And the change within the genetics of deafness resulted in a huge change in terms of the language ecology. So how could all of these changes have affected Aslan and could affect it into the future in its grammatical structure, for example? Trevor talks about the concept of critical language mass. And he feels that it's extremely important that you have, so to speak, native deaf people who have that heritage of deafness to keep intact some sort of structure of the language that is passed on and kept constant. Without that there, what does that mean for the language? And I think it's critical that that's included in the conversation. Now I want to take a little bit of a different view here. I want to look back again at Indigenous sign languages and Indigenous sign language communities. There's something extremely fascinating about them. Now, there's been work worldwide on very small, localized signed languages. Researchers go into these communities and document not just their language structure, but they actually take a very close look and document their social activities, their social networks. So language use in conjunction with the socialization and the social aspects of the community, both are looked at together. And it seems to be given them then a larger and more complete picture of deaf people in those communities as well as their language. Now those, remember, there's deaf people and hearing people in these Indigenous communities, and they all are signing. And there's one more interesting thing that I want to mention. This documentation that I just talked about shows that the characteristics of these Indigenous sign languages, which could be called local sign languages, some people call them shared sign languages. Something interesting about them, a characteristic that has been found, is that some of them are quite old, the 200 years old that they've been in existence. And up to like a 0.5% percentage of deafness in these communities, so a bit of a higher incidence of deafness than you would expect to see in these just outside of those communities. The incidence of deafness is usually quoted as 0.1%. You know, there's perhaps healthcare, vaccines, various things in the larger community that can prevent illnesses, and so there's less of an occurrence of deafness. But within these Indigenous village local sign languages, people have a very good awareness of deafness. They can sign, they can communicate one with another. And the way they all function seems to be, they function very well because they have this awareness, because they have this language, and the language is transmitted a little bit differently than with the majority sign languages because it's usually from adults to children. Because everyone, like I said, usually can sign in these communities. Now, we have to think about education policies. People have realized that children are being removed from these small communities and sent out into the larger community. They could be put in a school for the deaf or some sort of educational program, whatever's happening in that country, in that local area. And so they're being exposed to a different sign language. So now they have these 2 sign languages that they bring back to their small local community. So the result of this could be that they end up socializing more with deaf people outside in the larger community and are no longer as strong a member of that smaller community. And so the genetic pool there, for different reasons, but you'll get the same result where the genetic pool then is perhaps weakened again. So there are fewer deaf people as people leave that small community. So it's interesting to see when we look at both of this majority sign language and these shared sign languages to see the differences and the similarities. Now, if we think about what Ronice was discussing in terms of the Brazilian language policies, the establishment in 2002, that universities must instruct using Libras or give classes in Libras. So that means hearing people that know nothing about it can come into the university and learn about it. So the awareness goes up, more people know sign language, and they're sort of called regular, everyday, typical users of sign language. And they're not really that, but it's an important feature that it's something that they use on a daily basis. Maybe it's important, maybe it isn't. I'm not so sure about that one, but it's something to bring up for discussion. But the point of why I'm saying this is that as the awareness goes up, their exposure to sign language is there. And chances are that if one of them were to have a deaf child, it could be that because they have this awareness and this knowledge of sign language, maybe they would use sign language with their deaf child. So when we take a step back and take this bigger picture look at what's going on with the language ecology in the majority sign language communities, I think it's really more complicated than we've assumed to this point. So talking again about schools for the deaf having been established 200 years ago, where it was in the 1800s, 1900s, and for that long period of time that they were in existence, we haven't really researched what was happening in that time. It wasn't until later, of course, that there had been studies starting to happen. But as I said, when there was dwindling in the numbers in these schools, when schools were closing, that generation, that group of deaf people, and from their age on, I think that's a very important group from those groups from that time on. We need to take a look at them. We need to understand what's been happening with them, what changes have been occurring, and again, look at the language ecology and how this is impacting their language, the structure of their grammar, and so forth. My personal view on this is that language experience in general for any person is going to influence language use, which is then going to influence language again in general. So any definition or explanation of language use needs to include that. So when we're talking about grammatical analysis and trying to determine exactly what's going on with the structure, again, we have to look at the use of language, the function of language, what are people using it for, getting a better understanding of that, which could lead to an understanding of language change as well as language variations. And I think that's something that social linguistics could study and have studied. And I think there has been more of a recognition that that type of study is happening more and more. We're talking about including the community within the studies. Majority languages often are the ones. I think there could be more variation going on there than we realize. I know that there has been study on phonology, on the lexicon, and so forth, but not really much discussion or study on at the grammatical level. I do know that there's been work ongoing, but I think it's a little bit different because this was study of how language, the grammars within language change, it's called grammaticization. So of course there's been study on that. And within that field, there's the explanation that if you look back at the older sign language, the forms, for example, the structure, the function, as it was originally, and then as it's come down to today, you realize, my goodness, it's changed. And that's true for Libras, American Sign Language. There can be change in structure and clear change in the function as well. I think about sometimes our work typically we look at what I just said, but then we don't look at, okay, so what's happening from here forward? We look at what's happened from the past to now. I think the general view for majority sign language documentation, it sort of gives a feel that, or this idea, I should say, that it's stable. Majority sign languages are stable, not very changing, but I think we need to look twice at that. How is that even possible? Because we know that the language ecology was very different in the past and is changing, always ever changing. So how could the one be changing and language be stable? Language must also be changing. So these are just ideas that I'm hoping we can all think about, and I'm hoping you'll think about when you're doing whatever work it is you do, because I think we typically don't really make clear when we're talking about majority sign language communities what's actually going on there, who's actually a member of this community. Let me give you an example. Do deaf people still marry other deaf people? Do you see those deaf couples so much? I think just from my own anecdotal experience, I know of many deaf people that are married to hearing spouses here in America, in the United States and Canada. So that's an interesting question to think about. Another interesting question is, with all this mainstreaming that's been happening, thinking about the social interaction between deaf and hearing individuals, that increases the familiarity of one to the other. So what does that mean for their communication? I'm not saying that these hearing people are fluent signers, of course not. I'm just talking about them being familiar or aware about deafness. And I think that leads to another important point, which is that there are many hearing people today who, of course, are taking sign language classes. Thinking about Brazil, thinking about the States. Obviously, I think the two are very similar, that there's a lot of motivation and eagerness to take sign languages. Other countries I couldn't confirm about, but I wonder how that change in attitude, that increase in awareness, that openness, how does that impact this view of sign languages as language, that recognition and acceptance? So, and again, going back to indigenous sign languages and indigenous communities, those smaller shared sign languages, we have to think, oh, they're so different. They're different from majority sign languages, but they're still in place. They're still going. They've been a going concern for a long time, and they've already got that level of awareness established in those smaller sign language communities than is what is just barely starting to happen in the majority sign language communities. So I think it's an ecological impact, but I don't know what exactly the result is going to be of that language contact as that happens more and more. All right, let me see what I want to talk about next here. Hold on. Something here I do want to talk about. Okay, so there's this idea again of the two perspectives. Thinking about language or sign language systems, let's say. People argue these two views. Remember, I talked about this developmental type of view of signed languages or language in general, that they just follow this cline or this continuum, and they start at a lower level, and then it's this growth model, right, where they increase in complexity. They start out simple, basic, become moderately complex, increasing in complexity until they arrive at this fully complex, ultimate stage. Yeah. And so just like to add to that discussion, this idea about different signed languages and some case studies, for example, that Al-Said Bedouin signed language, ABSL, as well as Nicaraguan sign language. And thinking about that growth along some type of unidirectional path. That's one view. So a different view, which what I've been talking about, this ecological approach to language. Okay, the characteristics of language in that moment, the social characteristics in that moment, the language structure. Okay, it could be it's very robust, it's well known, it's familiar, and within the individual language users' representation in their mind, there's a very strongly shared awareness one to the other about their cultures, about the context. They all have that sort of ability to know the world knowledge of one another. And so there's less need to sort of have words for that sometimes. So we have this characteristics, and it's sort of fluctuating in terms of how much of it there is, but the impact that that has on language, I think we can see. So now, I'd like to, if we think about this and the idea that perhaps we accept this idea that there's this developmental path where you arrive at this so-called super language, this ultimate sign language, where it's arrived at that fully complex level or stage. All right, so if we accept that, what even is that? What does that look like? And what sign language has arrived there? Any that we know of? I wonder. And so I think what sometimes, or maybe often, people do when they talk about majority sign languages, that's what they mean. Majority sign languages have arrived at that ultimate level. Well, okay. So if we're thinking worldwide and looking at all the sign languages that there are many sign languages communities around the globe that have their own small mixed community of deaf and hearing sign users. And they all have their own local signs, grammatical structure, and so forth. And they don't have the same grammatical characteristics or features as these majority sign languages, but many of them have been in place for quite a long time, and they are in place all over the world. But if we think about majority sign languages, there's actually a small number in total of those types of languages. Should we still view those majority sign languages as prototypical sign languages? That's a little puzzling to me if we do that, because what exactly are the criteria we're using for this? There's been a wonderful discussion, I think, about trying to understand the difference between these majority sign languages and indigenous sign languages. But remember, I want to go back to what I talked about earlier about the change that could happen in the majority sign language community, and that has happened since schools for the deaf were established. They were very robust. Lots of people who did not know this language were all thrown together, and as I said, time went on, but then schools were closed, the numbers went down. What's happened after that point? I think if we looked at that, that would really help us get a better understanding of what exactly we can use within sign language and describe in terms of the relationship between the language to the community, the language structure. And I want to come back to experience and how language experience impacts language use, and then how the grammar of the language is impacted by that. All of this is ongoing, fluctuating, changing. It's not static. So when we're thinking about our community of researchers, our various perspectives that we have on this, our strong beliefs that we have, I think one thing to keep in mind is that deaf people have made an important contribution to human communication. And by human communication, I mean, think about deaf people's lives, their ability to navigate through what can be challenging situations, their development of concepts of the world and just everything you can imagine. All of that deaf people learn. I think that's more in line with what we need to take into linguistic analysis, grammatical analysis, documentation of languages, what we are describing. It has to be constantly in the back of our minds that we don't forget deaf people, their experience, how they've gotten where they are. It's not just that they're users of sign language. I mean, there's hearing people that use sign language. Some use it every day. Some of them are part of the deaf community. What's happening? How is communication functioning for these people? Keeping that in mind, then I think we can start describing, documenting, analyzing, and leading to a better understanding of how we as linguists can improve our analysis of languages, can improve our overall view of our definition of what sign languages are in general, perhaps spoken language as well, how the two are different. So that's one thing. Another thing, okay, within signed languages, we have to think about, do we see types, right? And how do we describe these types? I think we need to have some better tools in our toolkit. So again, documentation, description of what's actually happening in the social situation, the function of the languages, these sign languages. We have to include all of that with what we're documenting. Thirdly, taking a look at these sign language communities, we need to think about the general ability to generalize, I should say, from a certain population that we may be looking at. Is that actually generalizable to another group? Because we tend to look at groups within the larger overall population. So that's something to remember. And most important, we need to remember that language changes, right? Sign languages have to change. It's an ongoing evolutionary process. It's just what happens. So this idea of majority sign languages being stable and unchanging is, I don't believe, correct, because there's constant change happening. And we still really don't have a full understanding of what exactly is going on with these majority sign languages, what their social interactions are, what's happened since deaf schools have closed, since deaf associations, deaf clubs are not in existence. Where is all this sign language happening? Who is using it? I mean, we know it's happening, but this is something we need to learn more about. And so that needs to be better described and more well documented. And it could be that we need to recognize that with majority sign languages, they actually are more unstable than we perhaps have thought or have recognized to date. So I think this is a wonderful opportunity in the time we're in now to capture the type of language change and type of language variation are happening within the community, within the majority sign language communities, as well as the indigenous sign language communities. We can look at the two, compare them, and get a better understanding of just sign languages in general. And with that, I would like to thank everyone who's listened. I've completed my talk.
Okay. Marvelous. Wonderful. Okay. Thank you. And I really want to thank our interpreters. You have been doing an amazing job. Thank you. Thank you. All right. We have some questions for our panelists. And I want to start with Ronice. There were no particular questions that came up in the YouTube chat. And yet there were some things that I think I can pull and make into a question. One thing that you mentioned is that you have Brazil has passed a law explaining ensuring that deaf children be exposed to and have education in sign language from 0 up through the age of 18. And one question is, why? Why should exposure to a sign language happen so immediately after birth?
Well, thank you for that wonderful question. I think it's really a very critical question. So asking why it needs to happen at such a young age, you think about the foundational just the foundation of language for deaf children, most of the time their parents are not deaf. Their parents can hear, and so their parents do not sign. So therefore, it isn't until they get to school, but that's a lot of time. So we need to sort of plan and think about how during that time period before they arrive to school that they can be exposed to sign language. And they, of course, need to have that foundation of language developed. All we know from research for a long time has definitely shown that providing that foundation of language is very impactful on their cognitive functioning, their development as they grow throughout their lives and as adults, and then and their learning of a second language as well. So there's a lot of evidence that shows that all of language structure is based on and develops from that foundational first language. And so parents who are hearing and are unaware of that are unable to provide that. They don't know that information. And sometimes the resources that they are given, they're advised to not expose their children to sign language. And that is so completely the wrong message to be sending them, because the linguistic research that we know of shows so clearly, again, about having a foundation of that first language, and sign language is critical for deaf children. It's also, even if the children have a cochlear implant, it's still critical. Many of them are implanted, they still have to have that strong foundational first language. They're still going to be deaf even with the implant. They may learn some speech, and that's fine, but that foundational language, having it in place, is so basic to them developing language skills from there forward. So I guess that would be the answer to why.
Thank you so much. I wonder also if you might talk about, though, you mentioned cochlear implants, and many children are getting implanted at the age of 12 months now, very early. Why do we need to give them anything between 0 and 12 months? Why is it so critical that they get language input so early?
Thank you. Well, to answer the question of why, having that contact with language, again, that foundational language, phonology, the phonemes of the language and so forth, the morphology, having that firmly established early on, then language can grow from there. It has to be established early. So these basic units and aspects of language need to be there, even, yes, right after birth. Little babies that have just been born need to be exposed to that. They are learning that. That's starting the process. And from there on, it's like dominoes. I mean, it impacts everything from there on out. And so if that is missing, if that's not in place, if that first one doesn't fall, then how are the rest going to go, right? It's one depends on the previous one. And so when you're talking about language, again, language acquisition research clearly shows that the phonological aspects being in place, the phonemes and so forth, it must be there from birth. And, waiting is not a good idea. Yeah, even before they take their first steps, they need to be exposed to that language, has to be in their environment. They need to see the language around them, they acquire it, and that's where that development starts. So you have the phonology that leads to the further development. It's critical. They're not exposed to sign language from birth. It's as if their development, if they're not exposed to anything, nothing's being input, how's it going to grow from there? So let's say we're thinking about maybe a 2.5-month-old that hasn't been exposed to any language for 2.5 months. I've seen nothing. They've lost that opportunity. So even with that, seems like a small amount of time. Not having that will impact their future development, not being exposed to it. So hope that answers your question.
So do you have practical advice for parents, hearing parents of deaf children, since the vast majority of deaf children are born into hearing families? Do you have advice for them of how to expose their children to sign language right away, given that they don't know any sign language, most of them?
Yes. I have a few experiences I can tell you about. They have to have contact with deaf adults. Contact with deaf adults is so important. Here in Brazil, that isn't well established or going yet. But in Sao Paulo, there is a hospital there in Sao Paulo. And anytime when they do the screening or find out that a baby is born and cannot hear, they do say, well, okay, this baby needs to be implanted. But they do also have in place that they have to contact a deaf adult, and that person needs to be on the team that works with the family and so forth. So this deaf adult then can advise that team, including advising the family, so that the family can begin to find out about sign language, about deaf people, about deaf adults. It's so critical that the family know about sign language, right at the very beginning, so that they can start that communication with their child and their development can take off from there. So that collaboration with deaf adults, then they have that connection to the deaf community. It's an ongoing type of collaboration. So that begins there in the hospital. That's where it has to start. As soon as they know that the baby is deaf, then they have to have that contact, and it can go from there. And I'm thinking about early childhood before school, still little kiddos. They have to have a lot of contact with a lot of deaf people.
And what do you say to a parent who is worried about using their baby sign language, their incipient sign language, as a model for the child? How do you encourage them to get past this worry?
Yeah, that's a good point. Research, again, clearly shows that families who start signing and communicating with their baby, their little deaf baby, as soon as they have the deaf baby. It's of course a second language for the family. And of course, they're not skilled signers. It's a long process to become fluent using a language. However, that signing that those parents produce, incipient as it may be, still can help with that development. It still will be useful. Research has shown that kids, wow, even little babies, they're smart and they see what's going on around them. They see, even though it's kind of so-so, not great sign language input, kids still can take all that in and take advantage of what they're exposed to, and it will improve their development in the future. Again, it's crucial for those families to be able to learn sign language and to have a good path, for learning sign language. It may not be great, but it's going to benefit their child.
Thank you. I'd also like to ask you another kind of question that I think I can draw from discussion. You said that people will make generalizations about sign languages as though all sign languages do something. But they don't tend to do that about spoken languages. They don't tend to say tend to learn Spanish in Cuba and then assume that it's going to be the same in Mexico or Spain or anywhere else that Spanish is used, or even that it will be the same all around Cuba. And they don't think that about Chinese. And even linguists will do that. They will say, all sign languages have this characteristic. Why do you think they do this? What is going on?
Well, it could be, if I were to think about this, I guess my sense about it may be that people just view sign languages as lesser or less than. They don't see them as a true language. Maybe that's the reason. It's just a way it's viewed. Or sign languages in general appear to be gestural, perhaps, to people. Could be that it seems like it's all the same. There isn't this recognition of the complexity or the differences. So I think it's problematic that people do that. Sometimes, yes, linguists come at it that way. They see sign languages as less than rather than equal to or valued as a true language. Just as soon as sign language is viewed that way, I don't know, people don't realize the complexity. And I think with technology now, people are able to see more and more by watching videos. There's Elon, right? So that you can see the analysis of language and you can see the complexity. You can look at things over and over again. So technology helps people realize that it's so rich. There's so much in there. It's so complicated linguistically. And so in the past, we used a different type of notation in terms of English, spoken English glossing or so forth for how we documented sign languages. And I don't think that helped with that perception, because it sort of simplified it and didn't capture the complexity. So much happens on different parts of the body, and so much of it requires that the person look at what the signer is doing. There's stuff on the face, there's stuff that the person's doing in space. Are they using their dominant hand or their non-dominant hand? How was all that captured previously? I think a lot of it wasn't captured. And so all those grammatical features and so forth, all that grammatical complexity wasn't recognized. And so I think people need to change how they see sign languages. And some people still don't see that. Researchers who work with deaf people see it more. And that's why I said in my talk that I think we have to include deaf people, right? Because then you're exposed to that and then you see more of it, you find more of what's there. Sometimes we don't see it, we're not looking for it, we can overlook it.
I'm so grateful for that answer. I was baiting you and you took the bait in a beautiful way. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
We have some questions now for Rachel. Rachel, do you want to pop up?
Yes, I do.
Okay.
I think that's it. There we are.
Okay. I have a very short first question that someone asked, and I hope you will not be humble in answering it, because if you are, I'll answer the question. The question was, what book do you recommend that people work with if they're beginners in learning about sign language literature, sign language poetry?
Okay, well, going back to what I said, what sparked my interest, my love for the sign language poetry and sign language literature was that Klima and Belugi book. Their description of American Sign Language always seems to be underpinned by their joy of discovering the creativity and sheer genius of ASL. And yes, chapters 13 and 14, why, I don't know any other book where I remember the chapters of what information is where, except in that book. But honestly, if you go and look at chapters 13 and 14, that describes very clearly, so straightforwardly, some of the excitement of what we can learn when we look at sign language literature. Particularly in that they're talking about wit, they're talking about puns, they're talking about storytelling, they're talking about poetry, haiku. That all that information is there. They, to be fair, they were in right at the beginning of the explosion that was the development of ASL literature that really took off in the 80s. It's not a book, but I would strongly recommend a DVD that's now online. And it goes by the slightly unlikely name of The Heart of the Hydrogen Jukebox, which is an extraordinary name. But it's all about, if you think about the hydrogen bomb, it was bringing together an intense energy that then exploded. And that video, that documentary is about the development of ASL poetry at Rochester, New York, at the National Technical Institute for the Deaf in Rochester. And that there's a Portuguese language, there's a version of it that has Portuguese subtitles if you look for it on YouTube as well. So The Heart of the Hydrogen Jukebox, I really do recommend for people who are interested in all the influences, all that goes to create this fabulously rich creative sign language, what makes an artist, what makes the audience for it. I can't recommend that one too highly. They're both American. I love all you Americans dearly. There are other sign languages. Other sign languages are available. Those two are excellent. The book that Michiko and I wrote on introducing sign language literature, obviously I'd love you all to read. It does focus on BSL, on British Sign Language, but we tried, and Michiko brought in South African Sign Language as well, which is her area of study. And we've tried to make it as general as possible. So we tried to make it an introductory text. If you want something slightly more advanced, then there's a wonderful, again, an American book called Signing the Body Poetic, which edited by Dirksen Bauman and Jennifer Nelson and Heidi Rose, not necessarily in that order. Bauman, Nelson and Rose, I think it's that order. And that's also a book that I return to again and again. But the other thing I'd like to say, Donna Jo, is that we need to get beyond books. There is a wealth of stuff out there on the internet, on video, in Libras, in ASL, in BSL, in many of the European Sign Languages, in South African Sign Language, in Auslan. There's a wealth of resources out there on the internet where you can go and just watch this stuff and just bathe in it, and come up with your own ideas as well. And then, of course, shortly there will be another bilingual text in Libras and Portuguese where you can learn about Libras literature. We just need to finish it off.
Wonderful. Okay, now here's another question, which is huge. What are the differences between sign language poetry and visual vernacular?
Right.
Right.
Okay. Visual vernacular, I had it explained for people who aren't that familiar with sign languages. Sign languages each sign language worldwide basically has its own vocabulary. and its own variation in the vocabulary, but it has its own vocabulary. And if you don't know one sign language, and this is why I'm speaking now and not signing, I don't know American Sign Language vocabulary. I don't know it. I've got an idea of how the grammar works because visual grammars across sign languages are remarkably similar because sign languages operate in the spatial medium. They are highly visual, but each one has its own vocabulary. Now, when you're creating a sign language poem, one of the things that you can draw on, and you will draw on, is the vocabulary of your own language. It's fundamental to the expression. But sign language poetry is highly visual. It aims to communicate an emotional experience visually. That's essentially how it works. And sign languages have other options that go beyond simply their own vocabulary. And they are, to put it at its very simplest and most basic, they are more theatrical techniques that involve the signer incorporating, taking on the role of different characters. So their body becomes the character's body, and the character's body is their body. So the signer's eyes are the character's eyes. So if I go like that, then I am showing how somebody is alarmed. I become that person who is alarmed. Now, those theatrical techniques are drawn into the sign language grammar, this spatial grammar that we see, so that Bernard Bragg, B-R-A-G-G, who only very recently died last year, I think, who is one of the people who is considered to be one of the founders of visual vernacular. He brought together his theatrical skills, his skills in mime, and his knowledge of sign language and its grammar. And he brought those together to produce a style of signing that is a sort of a technique, a style that is highly visual and goes beyond the vocabulary, so it becomes much more international. So I don't know American Sign Language, but if I watch an American artist using visual vernacular, I can follow it. Now, you can tell a story using visual vernacular. You can create a poem using visual vernacular. You could tell a joke using it. So it's a style. Visual vernacular is a style that you could use in sign language poetry because sign language poetry is highly visual. But there are many other aspects to sign language poetry that will produce an aesthetic effect, that will create the emotion that you want in your audience that isn't necessarily created by the visual vernacular. You could do it through repetition. So, for example, Fernanda, the video that I showed that I hope people enjoyed, she uses classifiers. She uses a few signs from Libras, but it was highly visual, which is why I chose it. She took on the role of the rich person who didn't think, of the poor person who was working so hard, but she also showed things with her hands. Now, in that poem, she uses space very carefully. She uses repetition very carefully. I don't know whether people noticed, she goes from one finger on each hand to 2 fingers on each hand to 3 fingers on each hand to 4 to 5. So she builds all these things up with a very careful language construction that you wouldn't necessarily demand from visual vernacular, because visual vernacular is a highly visual style that is a blend of sign language grammar and mime. And if you want to know more, that's also described in the video, The Heart of the Hydrogen Jukebox.
Wonderful. Okay, we have another question for you. And this, I promise, will be my last one. But it's also quite, no, you don't have to be brief. The question is huge again. And, you know, perhaps other people on the panel will want to jump in. If they do, they're certainly welcome to. The question is, how does the study of sign language literature contribute to discourse analysis?
Well, it's a form of discourse, and it's an important example of a combination of language form joining with a cultural context and a set of cultural norms that lead to a particular cultural expectation. So to that extent, I would say that if you want to get involved in any kind of discourse analysis, to truly understand the context in which sign language literature occurs and the different forms and styles and ways of using that language and the norms within any community that uses it, that I would say that was going to be a major contribution if we're going to be talking about critical discourse analysis, if we're going to be talking about use of language for empowerment, use of language to show up social injustice, then I would say, for the point of view of critical discourse analysis, sign language literature is a really rich vein for people to go and mine. There is a lot of material out there that is incredibly powerful about social injustice. So, for example, Fernanda's poem isn't about the social injustice that you often see discussed, which is about the way that deaf people have been mistreated, mainly through lack of understanding by hearing people. The plea for social justice in a lot of sign language literature is for the equality between deaf people and hearing people and an understanding. But Fernanda's is about straightforward political justice, about the situation of poor rural workers around the world. But generally, sign language, and Michiko Kaneko has, this is her sign, by the way, Michiko Kaneko's sign name. Yeah. So she has also done work, for example, describing social justice movements through sign language poetry in South Africa that are not necessarily to do with deafness, but are expressed from a deaf perspective. And I think so much of sign language literature, basically, if a deaf person stands up and performs a poem in their own sign language, that in itself is a radical and empowering step. So I would say that from the point of view of critical discourse analysis, go into any sign language poem, any sign language story, any narrative of personal experience, and there you will find an enormous amount about empowerment through language, about ways that we can use language to further the respect, as I said in my talk, to further the respect for sign language and for the deaf community.
Thank you. I lied because I actually have one more question for you that did not come up from the discussion, but that I imagine may have been on people's minds. You talked about a deaf child who denied being deaf, who had a cochlear implant, and who viewed a sign language poem and changed his ideas. He got involved in it and was interested in learning sign language and interested in being deaf. Now, you treated this as though it was a pity that the child didn't want to own their deaf identity at the beginning. And my question for you, what I would love our audience to understand, and what I hope would connect to what Ronice was talking about, is why. Why should a deaf child, just because they have a particular audiological status, if they have a cochlear implant and they are functioning in a hearing world, Why should they also learn a sign language? Why should they incorporate deafness into their identity? What advantages are there?
Right. Well, I think my first issue is going to be with the idea that there's an identity. As what I was saying about the me's. This boy, and another word that you used that I always find very interesting is functioning. Nobody wants to function in life. You've got to get well beyond functioning. Honestly, to be a truly fulfilled, well-rounded human being, functioning is where you start from, not where you want to end. And here was a boy who and to be fair, he had a very good deaf teacher. This young woman I was talking to, she's very creative, she's very imaginative. And I'm not saying that this boy watching a short video about a deaf, smelly monkey who stole things and threw them away, or about the ant who realized that she didn't have any clothes on and went off to get dressed. I'm not saying that turned him round. I'm saying she used it and it was part of his language experience, his cultural experience, and he liked it and he was interested in it. He has the scope for multiple identities. He is who he's going to be, but that he is not always going to be able to function using just his cochlear implant. Using a cochlear implant is hard work and it's worthwhile for what you can get from it. And sign languages for many deaf people are languages of comfort, languages where you can relax and you can be another me. And to function and to be half a me and not to be offered at least the chance to be the whole me, I think is something that we shouldn't be denying anybody. If at the end of his time with Ecology, he said, yes, I know sign language, I'm really not interested in it, I reject it all, fine. But that he's been given this chance, that he's been shown the richness and he's been given an opportunity to see one of the me's he can be, personally, linguistically, and socially. I think, going back to what Ronice said, it's his right. And it's equally his right to say, I'm not interested. I don't want to explore that bit of me. But he really has got to be given the chance to explore that bit of his me.
Thank you. Wonderful. I feel like I'm baiting everyone tonight. And I'm so glad you took the bait and ran with it. Okay, now I'm going to turn to Erin. Hello.
Hello.
The questions that came up during your presentation were of a very large nature. So I'll give you one and let's see how they go. This question is there a movement in Europe and in the United States that intends to preserve the naturalness of sign languages? Or is the movement, if there is one, tending toward unifying, toward reducing the distance between oral languages and sign languages? I'm not exactly sure what the question means, but I lay it in front of you and let's see what you would like to say.
Okay, I will try my best. I think the first part is an important discussion to have. We think about Europe, the States, think of them as, let's call them the West, Eurocentric view, if you will, on sign language. And sign language research has been strongly centralized under that Western view. And I think that's a bit of a danger The reason I say that is because that would then mean that people become used to European, United States sign language as the framework, and then it's so easy to overlook something outside of that. And if we stay in that framework, we will not get an understanding or a realization of, say, cultural norms, social values, behaviors that actually clearly have a linguistic function. And so we have to, I think, be really cautious with that. I guess my point with what I'm saying here is that linguistic analysis, when we undertake such a thing, we have to be more aware of our implicit biases that have to do with what we are assuming or thinking should be somewhere or should not be somewhere. And regardless of what we assume about it, sometimes it just is. So, and I have a full story. I like using stories, so that's just me. I remember I was, still in grad school here at the University of New Mexico. And it just so happened I was invited to teach a sign language workshop in Afghanistan. And so that is a long story in and of itself, which we will go into at another time perhaps. But I was invited, and I was kind of young. I was doing my studies. I'd been at Gallaudet, new to UNM-ish, and training myself as an American sign linguist. So I went in there to Afghanistan, and I thought, I don't know what I thought, language stuff. What is phonology? I'll teach them. What is morphology? Maybe we'll talk about syntax. That's sort of where I was going with it. I was very naive, and so I went in with my description. I thought, okay, I'm going to draw this picture on the board. And I proceeded to draw a tree and a house and a cow and a river, because I was trying to give them an idea about spatial stuff. So that was drawn on the board. And there was this young fellow in the class, and I knew that he was a longtime signer. He'd attended a deaf school. And so I asked him to come up and describe what he saw on the board. And so he's thinking, okay. So he said tree, and he pointed to the tree, and then he said cow and pointed to the cow, and then he did house and the river. He pointed to the stuff on the board. So I was like, no, wait, that's not the point. I want you to explain, like if you were telling a story, I told him, how would you explain this? And I don't think he was understanding what I was asking him. My point was, in that moment, I suddenly realized two important things. First was that my belief was that discourse should happen in this interaction. That was the function of what was happening. And so I needed to revisit my own assumptions about that. He probably thought I was nuts. He was like, why is she asking me this? She's the teacher and she wants me to describe what she just drew on the board. I mean, can't she see with her own eyeballs what she drew on the board? Why did she ask me to describe it? So that's just one simple example. And I'm trying to give you an idea of some type of like a meta behavior that could perhaps, something that we're so familiar with that when you go to a new community, I'm just trying to pull language out and it just wasn't working. A second thing that happened, I was thinking about this later and I thought, all right, this isn't working. I've decided I need to watch everyone when they are interacting with one another and chatting, the students that I was teaching in Afghanistan. And when I did that, I started to realize they would maybe be having a discussion about, I don't know, I could talk to them about things they were familiar with, verb, agreement, or spatial modification, or meaning that there were some sign structures that I could show them that incorporated movement right from one location of space to another, so that had a specific meaning attached to it. So that's what I wanted to teach them. So I was taking a look at them to see how can I do this. And as I was watching them, I realized, okay, what's going on here is not what I thought. We're coming together at this school. There's deaf people here coming for this class, talking to one another. It came to me that bringing as I did my American-centered focus, my assumption that I would just come in, teach them what I wanted them to know, and pull out from them what I wanted to pull out from them. And I learned a very important lesson. It was a very important lesson for me as a young PhD student. And I became more aware from there on out about something. And I think it's, let's not assume, let's not jump in assuming we know stuff. Let's stand back and sort of take a look at what people are doing. People are already interacting. What are they doing? How are they signing? What are they talking about? What types of, I mean, how is the language functioning for them? Just anything that could be going on. Okay, so that's one part. So that's the answer to the first part of the question, I should say. So addressing the second part of the question, honestly, I'm not quite sure what that question was asking me specifically. Maybe I can partially answer it in a different way than how they asked, and I apologize if I'm misunderstanding the question. If people assume, let's say here in the States, American Sign Language means that there's one so-called national sign language. Well, yes, but also no. And the problem with that is, how are we going to define language? What does that mean? What are our assumptions about what that is? We need to think about, okay, American Sign Language is this, but then how many linguists are doing their work and they look at American Sign Language and then they also look at other deaf people, people from different walks of life within the United States. I mean, the United States is kind of large, and there are lots of deaf people that live very different lives and have had very different experiences. They come from different family backgrounds. They have all sorts of different environments they've been raised in, just everything that you can imagine. But I think, unfortunately, the linguistic research historically typically was very selective and would select a very specific group of deaf people as research participants. And some of it was sort of a bit of an idealized view on what was representative of a good user of American Sign Language. But ASL does not only belong to that small subgroup of the deaf population. I mean, if you look at all of the diversity of deaf people, and all the people that are using ASL, be they deaf or hearing, why is it that we are not truly looking at that full scope of people and being more inclusive? I was thrilled to see one thing. It was a kind of a recent example, and people have been talking about research on Black ASL from a variationist perspective. There's been quite a bit of research happening there, and I think that's wonderful because it adds to that idea that we need to broaden our idea of what ASL is. We think it's this one thing and nothing more, and that's just so not true. So having counter examples, so for example, Black ASL, to sort of show, wait, it's more than that. I just haven't seen enough of that. There hasn't been enough documentation and description of the potential variation within ASL and within that could show us certain social characteristics and so forth. There's so much, I think, that's out there that we just have no idea of what it is because we haven't looked. So that's an important point. Now, in terms of the political platform and what's sort of being pushed as the agenda is that it's easier to sort of pick one name to refer to everything. So I understand that political need that you sort of are going to have that push, of course. And it's possible that that's rational in a very specific context. However, when we go back to what it means when we ignore all of this variation, I think we have to think about the shared identity when we're talking about political identities and language variation. If that.
Yes, I think you understood that question in a beautiful way, and I think you helped me understand it. And you kept talking about looking. I think that there's a difference between having in your head a preconceived notion and going looking to confirm it, and walking in and looking at what is there. And this question, I think it's really very, very important. I have a friend from China who is a wonderful linguist, who says that had Chomsky been Chinese, the major theories of linguistics today would be very different. That is, Chomsky made a very Western picture of linguistic structure. And so many researchers have been looking for confirmation of those claims in language after language. And when people walk into sign languages, often they're doing the same thing. They're looking for confirmation of the things that have been said about spoken language. Okay, next question. This one is very large again. What theoretical framework of linguistics is more productive for dealing with sign language phenomena? And I'm not sure what productive means, but it's your question.
Okay, once again, I will try my best to answer that question. Okay. Speaking for myself, my theoretical framework is cognitive functionalist, specifically usage-based theory. And I understand that people on the panel, sign language linguists, they have a variety of frameworks and theories. We all are aware of that. So I can explain a little more about mine. I guess what my view is in terms of deaf people, their language and their language use, I like to see how they learn and what their experiences are and how that impacts what they acquire, what they take in, and what then the representations are mentally and what structures they have as the input that they're exposed to, again, and the frequency with which they're exposed to it. Things then become entrenched and very robust representations are in place. And there's a very robust network established cognitively. Let's say, I don't know, you only have one sign that you've seen maybe once or twice. You start building that network, but it can decay if you don't see it again, right? And so I don't mean that. My point is the frequency with which one is exposed to language. It depends on the experience and the interaction that people have with the language constructions. And so that's what affects the representations they have mentally. So I guess I view sign language not just as like a sign form. I mean, yes, of course, signs can have a single form or a single unit, but it could be that as sign is used in an utterance, then it becomes more than just that. Like a blend. If we think about, let's say if we think about a kid, I have a 6-year-old boy, my son is 6, and so of course you would, as you would expect, I get this complaint from him of I don't wanna. So, you know how they do. And so he could say no, which would be one unit, one form. It's highly frequent, very entrenched, very robust representation mentally. But if he were to sign it a little bit differently, let's say he does rather than no, I don't know, let's say he does no dog or something. Maybe in that combination, that if he often says no dog, he actually doesn't say that very often, so that one isn't as frequent. Let's say drink milk is going to be way more frequent. And if he says no milk, no milk, no milk, over and over again, it can become one construction and like a block within his mental representation. I'm so fascinated with how deaf adults, as they sign, and I watch, and I always love to watch how they sign. So interesting that there's some parts that I see are like piecemeal, right? As they're signing, and I will catch bigger or smaller units or chunks that I feel like it's more of that a blend of things. And often I feel like, well, what I'm hoping is that someone will research this and be able to find out and look back at how children are developing and acquiring language, because I'm seeing, like what I'm seeing with adults, some kids that know sign, I'm seeing the same thing that I'm seeing in adults. And I'm not a language acquisition person, but it's just something that's interesting to me when I watch different deaf people and their production of sign language, and I think of what I've seen with some kiddos, and I wonder about those mental representations, the schematization of all of this that's going on cognitively. Now, again, this is just me, my theoretical framework as cognitive functionalist, usage-based person. One way of explaining how sign languages produce that. It's just one way. It's just one idea for it, giving an explanation for what's going on there.
Okay, thank you. I'm gonna, I guess I can't. I'm having a little trouble reading my notes here. All right, we had another very big question that was brought up while you were presenting, Erin, but that was directed actually to the whole panel. And I think, Erin, if you would like to begin answering it or like to give your answer.
Sure.
And then, yeah, and then perhaps Ronice and Rachel would like to chime in or not. It's open, you know, we'll see. The question was, and I think probably this question was influenced by my introduction to the panel. The question is, what factors are hindering the progress of current research? Are we satisfied with the resources available to us? That's probably two questions. Let's separate them. But I don't know if you feel that present research has been hindered. I do. But if you do feel it, what do you think has hindered? What is hindering us?
Okay, I'll go ahead and start, and then maybe Ronice and Rachel will want to chime in, and maybe you as well. I think that's a complicated question, and the reason I say that is because it's dependent on what question you want to answer, like what you're looking for the answer to. So let's say, with a simple explanation, let's say I wanted to research American Sign Language, I don't know, something that's not possible because of where we'd have to focus. I mean, in terms of ASL, okay, let me say this. I'm thinking, if I were to think about wanting to, say, investigate language variation within the state of New Mexico, where I am, just as an example, I would need to think about a few things. Do I have the contacts to be able to access people who are native to the state of New Mexico, first of all? I would also think, who would be defined as a New Mexico deaf person? What would that even look like? And there, I think there's some different perspectives on that. Some people think it would be a certain group of people and some would disagree. So what qualifies as a New Mexico deaf person for a variety of reasons? It's like we have some social attitudes and different views on this idea of who can be defined as or qualified as a New Mexico deaf person. Another thing I'd have to think about now, again, something that's a little bit of an implicit issue. Thinking about the state of New Mexico, it's very diverse. It isn't just, well, it's a very large rural state, that's part of it, but the state has a very high number of Hispanic people. that have been here for generations. And New Mexico used to be part of Mexico, part of South America. There are also Diné or Navajo people within the state. And so, and of course, there are Anglos here that came to the area. So regarding that, the question is, let's say I'm deciding, okay, I want to research language variation in New Mexico. And what that is, well, I would have to think about, I think, a bigger question first, which is the social cultural layers of who has met who interacts with who, who's talking to who. How do I even define that communication practice that would so-called satisfy a criteria for deaf ASL research? And so that's why I'm saying it's very complicated with many levels. And so I would have to really do a lot of thinking. And I think if I were to be transparent, I have to be honest, sorry. I am a transplant. I'm not from New Mexico. I came to New Mexico. So is that going to impact the communication that I have with deaf people? You know, how is that going to work? I also would have to think, okay, I'm a university professor. How is that going to be perceived as some sort of power difference, perhaps? If I were to make use of a grad student to work with me, have a collaborative interaction there, how would we develop the resources necessary to I should say, fairly recruit in a fair way the people that I want to be involved with this ASL study? How would I even approach that? It's not simply a matter of sending out a flyer and saying, hey, everybody, are you interested? Come and be a participant in my study. I don't think it's that easy, because parts of the community are going to feel a little standoffish in terms of, who's this lady? Why is she interested in this? Some of them will be like, no, she's great. We want to work with her. But it's like, how do we partner? Even though I'm a deaf person, how am I going to make that connection with the deaf community? That process of involving different participants in the research, I believe, is far more complicated than most people think. And I've unfortunately seen all too often, I would have to say, and this is really important, we need to be respectful of people's decisions. If people want to be involved or they don't want to be involved, we need to be respectful of that. What do we give back? Like Ronice talked about during her presentation. We'll explain to them what my research is for and how it may benefit the community. Doing that, I mean, still to this day, deaf people will say to me, well, they'll say, I'll do this, but I'm only doing it because it's you. I'll get that. And then I get this sort of like shrug, like, why should I bother? What's in it for me? How is this going to benefit me? So when we see that, that just adds to the fact that we need to recognize how complicated of a problem that is. And when we look to the future, and thinking about now, it's like, okay, is this going to be published? How many publications are happening and they're being published in English? How many presentations about ASL are happening in English? And so it's like the deaf people are not going to those. They're not understanding about what the results of this are. So again, like what Ronice talked about, the ethical issues of research, it's so complex. And I think we have to have an ongoing discussion regarding that. And that applies very broadly to a bigger question, which is, as you were saying, what's hindering the process? I think there's many things. Because, for example, in the broader view, the university system of what is ethical research compared to the view of the community of people that we're researching, what they view as ethical, what an individual, perhaps myself, they may not always align. So that's another aspect and another challenge. So I guess that's my short and long answer.
Okay. If anyone, if Rachel or Ronice would like to speak at this point, that would be fine. I'm happy to move us to another question if they don't want to.
Should I leave my camera up or, oh, okay.
Yeah, maybe everybody should open their cameras at this point. Could we do that?
Yeah, I think that's a good idea, says Erin. I think we all should be up here.
Thank you. Okay, so the evening, it's interesting how Ronice and Erin explicitly talked about ethics, but ethics were definitely foundational to what Rachel was talking about as well. Ethical issues are on the minds of pretty much anyone who works with the analysis of sign languages and with deaf communities. And one of the questions that came up is for all of us, but I'm wondering if Ronice might want to approach it first. And that is, I'm reading it, in terms of language rights, do you think sign languages could be related to, how do we relate them to minority language rights?
I think that's an interesting question. When you think about the idea of minority, it's usually in comparison to majority. And it's true that there is an importance to recognizing that more small number of signers, but I think something else that's important, and they all live in the same location, they use language and is similar to the majority language. I think, well, let me try and explain it better, hopefully. People tend to think that numbers sometimes can drive the thinking of how to establish questions for researchers. So big, small, minority, majority, it's all relative to numbers, right? So if you're thinking about all the deaf people in Brazil, is not a small number, it's a large number of people. But if you were to compare the hearing speakers or spoken language English users, is a much smaller. The deaf community is smaller in comparison. So it's easy to think that, I mean, the deaf community is oppressed. It's easy to see that and feel that. But what I've been seeing through this idea of language planning and all that I've been talking about with the deaf community and including their inputs within this process and following their path, is that the hearing people don't know how deaf people feel. And the deaf people just get frustrated because the hearing people can't understand. And so then the deaf people will tell them so many times, they'll say, I'm just overwhelmed, or you don't know, and they just feel oppressed again, and then they don't want to continue. So how do we deal with that? And how do we collaborate? How do hearing researchers work with the deaf community when all of this is happening? That's something that I think is important for our minds to be open. We need to be respectful and willing to work. I think it's easy to just follow your own path and not think about anyone else and not try to understand them. But when we have our minds closed, we can't see anything. So that's why we need to have an open mind. We need to look, and we really need to look inside of ourselves as well. And really invite the other collaborators to help us understand. And when they realize that we're asking them to help us understand, most of the time they will also be open-minded and we'll be able to have this relationship and this collaboration. Because if they actually see me as a hearing researcher trying to throw out my own assumptions and my own feelings and this power disparity, if I'm trying to erase that and change my feelings, it's going to impact the situation.
We had a little clarification from someone. He says, many deaf people like me feel linguistically repressed from the perspective of their listeners, who they're communicating with. And, you know, he's been trying to work through this feeling and relate it. He says, he's just adding, he keeps adding. He said, sometimes I'm afraid that the naturalness of sign languages will be lost along the way. Yes, Rachel.
Is that better? I'd like to add here why I think sign language literature can help. I think when we look at sign language literature, that's a place where we do see a natural expression of who I am as a deaf person, my deaf world experience, my knowledge of the deaf world, how I feel about the deaf world. And I think one of the things there's a freedom within sign language literature, as I said, from deaf people and often about deaf topics aimed at deaf people in the language of deaf people. I think that's one place where people are free to express themselves in what I hope would be seen as a natural way, where there isn't this feeling of right and wrong. There's, are you enjoying it? Am I enjoying it? And I think where people can celebrate all the different me's that they are in sign language literature, maybe that's the place, telling stories, telling jokes, laughing, sharing deaf experience through language. That's where people can be so natural. And I think if linguists are studying that sort of naturalness, I think maybe that's one of the ways where people's naturalness can come forward.
Mm-hmm. And I'd like to jump in here too. I think that there is a tendency in linguistics to say, this is what people did, or 80% did. And the others are treated as though this other 20%, they belong in a footnote, or they don't get described. And we can start to have the feeling that what these people are doing is correct and what these people are doing is lesser somehow. Linguists may be very unwittingly contributing to feelings of discomfort within deaf communities as people compare themselves on languages. It's a difficult thing. That's part of, I think, one of Erin's points of walking in with your eyes open and seeing what you see, as opposed to walking in looking for something and then you latch onto it. As sign language linguists, we have maybe a much greater responsibility to pay attention to everything we see, because of the possibility of doing damage if we don't. Our time is just about up. Is there anything that anyone did not get to say that they would really love to say before the evening ends? I am hoping that the audience will bring away something from this discussion that I imagine is pretty different from discussions that you've been looking at in this series on spoken languages, which is the sense of the need to understand the community that you're dealing with. Lots of times in linguistics, you can think, here's the language, here's the person. In sign languages, if you do that, you will miss a great amount of information, and you may well risk having people not want to work with you, not be forthcoming with information to you, because in fact, your mind is closed. Ronice did this as opening your mind over and over, and it's very beautiful. Language is such a great part of who we are. It's so deeply in our core that when we are dealing with a community for whom the very right to have language had to be fought for from the time they were little tiny children growing up, we have a responsibility to pay attention and be grateful for whatever is offered to us and to treat it with great respect. Ethics was the foundation of all three of these talks, even though all three of these talks were so different from each other. And I hope that all of you students of linguistics will keep in your minds, keep it there, that the whole point of knowledge, the whole point of your education, I think, is to improve life somehow. Go forward in the most decent, ethical way you can, particularly when you're dealing with language, which is so important to people. And within that group, especially with people who are so threatened with respect to their right to language. Thank you so much for attending, and thank you to our interpreters who have been magnificent. You are just wonderful. Wow. Okay. Good night.
Thank you. Good night. Thank you. Bye-bye.